I wrote my first book, Adventures of a Psychic. To recap just a bit, I was born psychic, as my grandmother Ada Coyle was, and her mother before her, and on it goes for approximately 300 years. Throughout my life, my soul has been tried to the limit. Everyone thinks that because you're on television or in the public eye, you're living a glamorous life. Not true. I walk the same path you do. While my psychic ability isn't affected by normalcy, which I give God credit for, Sylvia Browne, the woman, still goes through hurt, joy, pain, worry over family and friends, divorce, bills, cars breaking down, a garage flooding, and on it goes. What keeps me going on the 21 tenets I'll be discussing shortly. These 21 principles came directly from my spirit guide, Francine. For those of you who don't know, Francine has been with me my entire life. I first heard her at the age of 7, although I can't take listening to her for very long because her voice comes into my right ear and sounds like a bad Alvin in the Chipmunks record. I therefore prefer to go into trance and have Francine speak through me and give me information. The tenets came from her while I was in such a state, and they were brought back from the ancient Gnostic text. Now, while there's 21 principles might seem very simplistic, when you go deeper into them, you'll discover that they're far more spiritual and in many ways carry a deeper meaning than they may seem to be on the surface. Maybe if you could see what I see or hear what I hear, you'd know that their depth goes far beyond what the words seem to hold. Here I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'll go through the tenets one by one and show you how they relate to me in my journey. Some of you may respond to what I discuss, while others may feel that it's too far out there for you. Just think of what I'm about to share with you as a chronicle of a life. That is, don't simply look at it as a psychic life. Of course, that's part of it, but so much of these principles refer to all of our lives in one form or another. In the tenets of our society and the stories that accompany them, you'll see your existence and that of your loved ones reflected. You'll also note how we struggle to get out of life and not succumb to that dark place of futility or depression. This book is not a course, but rather a very direct commentary on things we don't understand. Maybe I can shine a light on it so that it's not so confusing. Gnostics and Novus Spiritus. You'll see that this book is an autobiography in a sense, but it almost has to be to show you how I came upon these tenets, which are the cornerstone of our church's belief. I started, or I should say, attempted to start a society in 1973, but it became a non-profit foundation for research of the paranormal. One of the things I'm grateful for is that today the Society of Novus Spiritus is thriving with hundreds of study groups around the world. For years, the Gnostic movement has tried to form a religious organization, whether it was the Cathars, the Knights Templars, or the Essenes, and all were either wiped out by the Catholic Church and reigning powers, or they went underground. A Gnostic is one who searches for truth constantly with the grace of an all-loving and all-knowing God, and uses spirituality and love as their weapons against negativity. The Gnostic movement is very ancient and wasn't just confined to Christianity, as most people think. In actual fact, it existed before the time of Christ, but was mostly obliterated by the 5th century after the Roman Emperor Theodorus I officially recognized only one branch of Catholicism. Gnostics have been burned, tortured, and driven out. But they are not a threat to anyone except those who want occult control. I do want to pause here to clear up some information about Gnosticism in our church. Not only has Gnosticism been around for thousands of years, but there are many schools and teachers out there in the world today. Not all of Gnosticism is Christian-based, and even Christian Gnosticism has different sects and beliefs. There are many aspects of Gnosticism that Nova Spiritus doesn't practice or believe in, but we have tried to form a religion that has its basis in Gnosticism, and one that especially follows the teachings of Christ and the dualism of our creators, that is, Mother and Father God. At the Society of Nova Spiritus, we don't purport to know every truth, since the whole concept of gnosis essentially means to seek truth. We're constantly in flux as we do so. That's why we basically have no church-made dogma or rules other than the golden rule. That is, we try to help others by doing good works with love and the belief in our Lord and the duality of God. Our 21 tenets reflect what we believe, and they've added to as truth becomes apparent. We accept all, regardless of their previous beliefs, race, ethnic background, gender, and so forth. No one is turned away, especially those who are seeking truth, enlightenment, or a loving God. It is a moving, hands-on, living spirituality that's promoted by all. The Society of Nova Spiritus, which is going into its 19th year, has spread across the United States and other countries in hundreds of study groups. We used to meet in our offices in Campbell, California, but our congregation grew to be too big. Now we have 4 so-called churches, or I should say meeting places, and we're still growing. So the society was founded and accredited, and the tenants that had set their gathering dust began to take hold and form the basis of our beliefs. They seem to echo the Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount, the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, and the gentle portions of text from the Quran. And they serve to bring into focus the simplicity of what every one of them tried to say. The tenets aren't new, but they have been condensed. They were formed out of our Gnostic philosophy, and the only problem we encountered was that when people thought about God, they tended to think in the singular sense of God the Father. Thus, we added a tenet to recognize the duality of God and to acknowledge the existence of the God, the Mother. Several of our tenets are also highly controversial to standard Christian belief, but by no means do they take away from the divinity or teachings of Christ. I'm highly controversial as it stands, so why not just put all the truth out there for everyone to read and see? Besides, where would the fun be if I didn't? So having said that, I hope that you enjoy accompanying me on the very personal journey I'm taking you on. Tenet 1. The way of all peace is to scale the mountain of self. Loving others makes the climb down easier. We see all things darkly until love lights the lamp of our soul. My life started out being psychic, and for better or out of ignorance, certainly not worse, I went with it. God knows that it hasn't been an easy road, but I'd never change it. It's been rewarding, of course, but I've also experienced rejection and skepticism of the highest order. Yet when we write our chart, that is, of course, the life plan we plot out before we're ever born, and have a goal for God and our own soul's perfection, we follow it the best way we can. When I wrote Adventures of a Psychic, many individuals I mentioned were still alive, so I had to couch what my life had been like in somewhat vague terms. People are very smart, so when I wrote about my childhood, they read between the lines. Now, however, so many of them are gone that I can go into greater depth about what my life was like. Shortly after my first book was written, I had to declare bankruptcy and was hit with an astronomical IRS bill. This was because my then husband, Dal, out of ignorance and not malice, opened up a gold mine that was recommended by an attorney. He forgot to fill out a securities form, so they came down on us like a ton of bricks. Now, in my experience, when you fall in love, there doesn't seem to be any mountain too high to climb. We could almost float up rather than climb because we're so euphoric and our endorphins are racing, not to mention our hormones. But when that goes south, the journey down is miserably hard. We feel foolish, battered, rejected, and bruised in our soul. When I was a young girl, I truly dreamed of a house and children and a husband who loved and supported me. Well, when my chances came, I kept telling myself, it's not right. For example, I was engaged to two men who loved and wanted to make a home for me. One of these wonderful guys died just a few months ago. And one of the last conversation we had points out the differences of our charts and the what could have been scenarios. I started out by asking him, what if it had been the other way and I had agreed to marry you? Joe wisely replied, no, Sylvia, it wouldn't have worked. The world was calling you so loudly that even I could hear it. But still, in the human part of my brain, we wonder, chart or no chart, what if? And that's how I felt when my marriage to Dal broke up. We divorced partly because of my anger resulting from trying to be so loyal and above board, even as I let someone else foolishly jeopardize a church and foundation I'd built. I went from having not one smudge on my record to people running amok with money I didn't have. But it was really my fault too, because I was so busy with lectures, ministers, and readings that I left the business end to someone who'd made a catastrophic and foolish mistake. I felt that my life was over. My home and car were gone. All my possessions had to be sold. I had no credit, so I had to try to pay for everything in cash. On top of that, I was taking care of my aging parents. They were in their late 80s at the time, and they were failing. My mother's behavior, which was always a real nightmare, was becoming even more erratic. My father, who was working with me, was also taking a turn for the worst. On top of that, my book, My Guide Myself, had flopped because the publisher, New American Library, had been sold to Dutton, leaving my book to fall through the cracks. And people are talking a local show in the San Francisco area, on which I had often appeared and had been my main public relations outlet, was suddenly canceled. It was during this time, which I call the dark period, that I happened to pick up the Tenants. In that moment, I began to see their surface and deeper meaning. Dear God, I whispered, this is truly the treasure map to keep us on track. You see, everything passes and everything changes. What's bad today can turn on a dime tomorrow, and what's good can also turn bad. None of it lasts. If we're depressed, we can alleviate it by loving outside of it and getting above ourselves. All the lights will come on, especially the light of the soul. How can this tenet help you? From a spiritual standpoint, the whole meaning of this first tenet points to climbing the mountain of your own ego. Climbing this mountain is difficult until you come to the understanding that you're a spiritual being who came here to experience for God and yourself. When you get that, then it's just like being in physical love. You'll float down the mountain and realize that loving others really does light the lamp of our soul. When you stop to help a person and truly love them unconditionally for who they are, you're fulfilling your chart. In turn, you'll like or even love yourself for the good that you've done. I think it's very important to do this many times without fanfare and even recognition. It doesn't matter if it's for your animals, your friends, your garden, or your family. The key here is to love. So light your lamp of love, and the world that may seem dark becomes the light of your own Christ consciousness, or whatever your beliefs may be. Tenant 2. Whatever thou lovest, lovest thou. I'm sure that your reaction to this tenet was like my own. Hey, that isn't always true. When we love others, we have the high expectation that they're going to love us back. But I've certainly cared deeply for another person and not had that feeling returned. Well, I'm not just talking about the affection between a man and a woman here. We also love parents, children, friends, relatives, pets, and so on. So many times we do pick the wrong person to care about because, as I'm convinced, love is not only blind but deaf and dumb as well. Yet we can't just blame everyone else. We have to be honest with ourselves. Are we lovable? Or are we too demanding? Are our expectations beyond the norm of reality? Are we in a state of loving someone unconditionally? Now, in no circumstance do I believe that a person should stay with an abusive spouse. I did in my first marriage because I was ashamed and thought it was my fault. Sometimes, though, even when what we love isn't good for us, it can lead us to a better place. My first marriage, as abusive as it was, led me to California, where my career took off. And then with my dreams in hand, I tried it again. Dal and I did have a happy marriage for many years, but eventually it didn't work. My third and last husband seemed to be a kindred soul, but he left me for another woman, claiming that I was so popular now that I didn't need him. Of course, I sat back and wondered, what in God's name is this about? So I've had to learn just like everyone else. Every story has two sides. So perhaps I was too busy and caught up with my church, people, and career, causing my last marriage to go by the wayside. But now, 3 years out, life is full of love again. My time is filled with friends, companionship, pets, clients, and especially all of you. And it's all good. A friend of mine says that having a bad relationship is like having an elephant in the front room. You can't hide it, you can't dust it off enough, and you have to clean up after it. No matter how much you pretend, it's still there. Getting back to the second tenet, I know that it may sound like an oxymoron considering what we've been discussing, but here comes a spiritual insight. You gave your love to the wrong person, so where does that love go? Well, as Francine, my spirit guide, says, it's like electricity. It can never be destroyed. No, it may not have hit the target of your focus or attention, but it did go somewhere. However, why give your love to someone who's dark and unworthy? You're not at fault and you can learn from it. But you don't have to keep loving and giving and casting those proverbial pearls before such swine. How can this tenet help you? Instead of living with the rejection of those few people who can't or won't love you back, find someone who will. My grandmother, who was full of proverbial folksy sayings, used to say, Sylvia, if you take your wares to a poor market, no one will buy. So true. If you happen to be a victim like I've been, then you can understand that gut-wrenching feeling of rejection. You feel as if your heart is broken and it will never be mended. But sorry is a person who has lost love and cannot love again. If you fall into the trap of why me, or I did everything right and I don't deserve this, for too long, then you might as well crawl into that dark hole and stay there. All of us have a tendency to do this somewhat, but you've got to get out of it as quickly as possible or you're going to wither away. When my last husband left, I was devastated, but my old boyfriend's words kept coming back to me. the world called you. So I just told myself that the planet and the people in it are my love affairs, and it should be for you too. Love your friends, the grocer who helps you with an extra good cut of meat, and the old lady whose eyes light up when she sees that you've come to visit her at the nursing home. Love your children, your friends, and your pets. Love spills out everywhere, and if you put it in the right place, it will come back to you 1,000-fold. The world is full of things of every size and shape to be loved, including people of all creeds and colors, sunsets, animals, nature, or even the first cup of coffee in the morning. When you've been hurt, start with the small and then grow spiritually into bigger things. I promise you that just like it did with me, someone or something will fill the place of what you've lost if you're not too blind to see. The life you live goes in circles that widen, and if you let it, it will take in more people to love. Don't forget that you can have a wonderful love affair with the teachings of Christ, Mother or Father God, are also your guides and angels too. Tenet 3. Do not give unto God any human pettiness, such as vengeance, wrath, or hate. Negativity is man's alone. The third tenet is especially dear to my heart. I have researched it, logically gone over it, and seen it in action as miracles. But it really just comes down to plain old street smarts. Where does one begin? I asked myself almost 40 years ago to try to explain our Creator, who has been defamed for centuries. All throughout theological history, humans have viewed God as not only the Creator, but also a being who played favorites. He was supposedly capricious, jealous, wrathful, and punishing, and he played for favor. Let's not go into the theological areas here. Instead, we'll just go with plain, honest logic. Once we were all created from good by God, who gave us free will, and we all made our own choices. So if we have a loving God, then we logically have to stay with that. We can't waffle. Once we grasp this logical, well-founded concept, then we're in league with the God whom Christ loved and followed. And we can see as he did the hypocrisy and pettiness of humankind. Then we, as Christ said, become the temple in which God resides without vengeance, hate, jealousy, or pettiness. The role of fear in religion plays on the insecurity of humankind. We're afraid because we categorically don't know who's right or wrong. We seek solace and comfort in the fact that there is a full cathedral, church, mosque, or synagogue. After all, if so many people believe in this practice religion and attend, then they must be right. I don't want to pick on any religion, but at one point, if a Catholic ate meat on Friday and died on Saturday, he or she went to hell. Then the law was changed. But what happened to those who already had gone to hell? Were they told to come back up? Why would God even care what we ate? I know I'm oversimplifying what we originally considered a sacrifice of abstinence for God, but it was a stupid part of human-made dogma. This was only eliminated a few decades ago. What in the hell took them so long to change it? Tradition and the refusal to change are the bane of all religions. More times than I can number, people ask me, why is God doing this to me? First of all, be reasonable. God doesn't play Russian roulette with our lives. And this why me has a definite answer. You simply chart to learn. And the toughest things tend to be left until the last life or incarnation. I used to wonder why, but logically it makes sense that we pick the hardest test to learn from and then graduate so that we don't have to come back into life. At the same time, we also carry a greater amount of accumulated knowledge in the soul to deal with these tragedies. You and I are partners with God in this journey of life. You might ask, why doesn't God always answer prayers? He or she does, but often has to turn down your pleas, not out of malice or pettiness, but because it would be against your learning curve. It's much like telling your school counselor that you don't want to take speech and calculus, and then being told, that's fine, but you won't graduate. So when you feel yourself abandoned, just know that you're not. God holds you forever in the palm of His and her hand. God loves all people of all creeds, colors, sexes, and religions. How could He, she not? Didn't He, she make all of us? How can this tenet help you? Remember that if you're obsessed with the idea of retribution, then it's like the ancient proverb says, when you go for vengeance, you had better dig 2 graves, one for you and one for the person you go after. It may seem that evil prevails sometimes, but it doesn't. You just might not see the justice you're seeking in this life, for it will be done in God's time, not yours. Evildoers have to keep coming back until they're finally absorbed into God, while we keep our own identity as a shining example of His and her goodness. We've got to get back to the basics of loving God and accepting His and her never-ending love for us. God is love, and that love doesn't hurt. It's never cruel and accepts us for the sum total of who we are and who we were made to be, rather than what religion's human-made rules have placed upon us. If we just followed what Jesus taught and did, then we'd be on our spiritual simplistic track and love the God who is gentle, kind, and omnipotent. Tenet 4. Create your own heaven, not a hell. You are a creator made from God. I know that at times this may seem like a self-indulgent autobiography than a text on spirituality. This is partly because I'm sharing what these 21 tenets have helped me learn from my own life. For example, there was my grandfather, Marcus Coyle, who lost every penny in the stock market. Although it was during the Great Depression, every day my grandfather would sit in the waiting room of the Pacific Gas and Electric looking for work. And every day the head of the company would come out and say, "Sorry, Marcus, we have nothing for you today." For 1 year, my grandfather followed this routine. Finally, the CEO told my grandfather that he was sick of seeing him every day and that anyone who had that type of perseverance deserved a job. My grandfather was able to create a heaven out of his hell. On the other side of this coin, you have my mother. It's hard to understand how she could have come from the same family as my wonderful grandparents. Her brother Marcus, who had cerebral palsy, but was an angel on earth whom everyone called brother. And her brother Paul, who was also psychic and used to talk to God daily before he died of cancer at the age of 21. My mother was not only abusive physically, but her greatest forte was to try to damage her family members with mental abuse. Now, I could have wilted under her abuse and become like her, but instead I went under my beloved grandma's wing and basked in the light of my dad's approval. As I grew into my late teens, my father was making $3,000 a month. That was a fortune in those days. So I didn't have an underprivileged upbringing in those years, but I truly would have forgone that for a semblance of a happy home. Yet I honestly can say that I was happy overall because I had the rest of my family and my friends. I chose to respect my mother while at the same time putting her on a shelf in the back of my mind. During this time, my grandmother fell on hard times. My grandfather had died, and Grandma Ada was taking care of brother. It's very difficult for me to relive this portion of my memories, for my mother stuck them both in a literal flop house. I remember the day Grandma Ada and brother moved in. I saw that my beloved family members were going to be reduced to living in a dirty one-room flat with a communal bathroom down the hall. My grandmother always made a heaven out of a living hell. For example, she even lit up that dingy cell-like room with love and joy. I used to pray, God, please let me just be 1/10 as strong and brave and positive as she is throughout my life. Well, I won't lie or be humble, but I can honestly say that I've arrived at the point that my grandparents reached, but I tried valiantly. I can say that I got divorced from my abusive first husband, Gary, and was relegated to tenement living, where there was algae all over the pool in the back. I even told my boys that it was just water lilies. However, after 2 ear infections, I decided enough was enough. I was so strung out at the time with my ex-husband's threat to kill us that I didn't know if I was coming or going. At one point, as I was raising the kids by myself, teaching school, doing readings, and attending classes, I began to see that my life wasn't going the way I wanted it to. It felt like an endless circle of readings, teaching, raising children, school, and nothing else. Then I began to ask myself, what do you want, Sylvia? I really wanted to teach and help people, but I also needed to give the children a good home. So I quit my job as a school teacher and opened my foundation. We had 2 rooms and taught classes in the evenings, and I brought my kids with me. Sure, finances were really tight, but the trade-off was great. It was a process of selection. I had my family with me because when they were in school, I did readings in my home, and 3 nights a week they went with me to lectures or teaching. Life went on and on. It could take on a Shakespearean quality, but you roll with it. When my third husband, Larry, exited 3 years ago, things became quite difficult. I like having partnership in this point in my life, but I also feel that people my age or even younger should find fulfillment by doing what they feel is right, not what society dictates. Anyway, right in the middle of the divorce, Dal Brown showed up at my office and told me that he was getting a divorce from his wife of 2 years. We kept in touch sporadically since our divorce, and one thing led to another. Although Dal has had many serious health problems shortly after both our divorces were final, we decided to become companions for one another. After all, I've known him for almost 40 years. All the old hurts were forgotten. What he'd done with our finances had been out of stupidity, not malicious intent. So we're friends. And even though he doesn't share any part of my business, it's nice to have someone around who knows me. He has his life, and I have mine, but we try to spend as much time as we can with each other. As you can see, with the closing of one door, another opens. Even though I was hurt by my last divorce, I found solace in the fact that there is so much good in my life. These days, my perfect setting is coming home from being on the road, sitting next to the fireplace with my granddaughter, Angelia, needle pointing and talking, while my grandson, Willie, plays with his toy trucks. That's when I tell myself, this is your heaven right here, Sylvia. How can this tenant help you? When things used to happen to my children and me that were wonderful, I'd always say, close your eyes and save it. Because when things go wrong on that awful, dark, rainy day that life gives you, you can take this out like a scrapbook of your life. Cherish this moment, and it will brighten even your darkest hour. Not only do you need passion as you realize your path, but you also have got to prepare and steel yourself against the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. It's true that bravery comes with a price, but know that you're building on your mistakes and heartaches. Rejoice that you're not only climbing the mountain of self, but you're also learning to love unconditionally, as well as giving yourself to an all-loving God. And that's where you'll find your heaven, here on this earth. Tenet 5. Turn your power outward, not inward, for therein shines the light and the way. As opposed to the last tenet, which was internal, this one is proactive and more external. Of course, power must start inside. If there isn't anything in there, it's pretty difficult to turn the power light on, especially when the cord isn't plugged into anything. Sometimes it's best to just take a moment and decide if we're feeling happy or dull, with no passion that can propel us outward in our lives. When we turn outward, then, as the tenet says, therein shines the light and the way. The light means, of course, spiritual enlightenment, while the way is following the teachings of Christ. He, of course, was very spiritually enlightened and certainly didn't sit around. Rather, he chose to focus his power outward. He walked and talked, taught and healed. Now, Francine has always said that we all have more power than we could even realize or know until we use it. At first, this made me crazy. Okay, then I asked her, where is it? And how do we use it? When she told me to look at the concept deeper, it became clear that it was related to miracles. For example, there is a story of the 90-pound mother who actually lifted a huge SUV off of her son who was pinned underneath. He came out with just a concussion and a broken leg, but authorities said that the SUV had been left on top of the boy. He would have suffered internal injuries due to the weight of the vehicle. Many say that the mother's strength came from a rush of adrenaline, but it doesn't matter. There was a surge of power that defied all explanation. You can call this the energy that always comes from God, but it's actually lying beneath the surface in all of us and can be used when called upon by a desperate need to save, heal, or simply make a situation better. How can we ordinary people do outward healing? Well, each and every one of us has the energy to do it, and it can be physical as well as mental. Now, don't get me wrong, it's important to address physical concerns, but when the mind and soul are convinced of its spiritual path and light, it is healed. Just as we aren't the car we drive, we just operate and then exit it. We aren't the physical shell we inhabit. Think of the power of any emotion and watch what it can accomplish. Love can almost move mountains. Unfortunately, so can hate and vengeance. I truly love my life now, even though it took many years to keep that power steady. There were periods when I loved it and times that were heartbreaking and dismal, with death, divorce, and betrayal. But you know what? I found out that as we constantly reach towards our passion, our power gets stronger. And it's that power that's turned outward. How can this tenet help you? Even given the nature of your chart, you still can create miracles or make your schooling here so much more enjoyable by literally putting on a happy soul and projecting your power outward. You can make yourself as well as you wish to be and have even more physical strength by doing the right things for your body. But what's vitally important, no matter what age you are, is that you believe you're strong, not sickly, fragile, or frail. Now that we've addressed the outward manifestations of strength and power, I'd like you to realize that not everything comes down to your instinct and survival. It also comes from your soul and even from life, which has hopefully given you the strength to get through your hurdles and sorrows. Even if your power isn't psychic, Maybe it lies in building a boat or running a small business. The world is filled with options, but we seem to be infected by a type of malaise that threatens our health and creates more mental stress. Every time I hear, "I'd like to do it, but I haven't gotten around to it," I always respond, "Do it now. Make the time." Just keep in mind that when I started to write and share my research, I endured years of scoffing and critical and cruel rhetoric. But if you're full of conviction and walk in truth, you're going to make it, just like I did. So many people can't get out of the box. All I ask is that you try. Believe me, if you do, you'll notice that there is sunshine, fresh air, and blessings all around. Tenet 6. In faith, be like the wind chimes, hold steady until faith, like the wind, moves you to joy. Life themes have been written about many times in my books, but it should be explained that these are actually subjects that we choose to learn from in order to become what God wants us to be. We don't tend to pick the same themes for each life. Rather, we choose different ones that will help us expand our knowledge for God and ourselves. Usually, all the themes are for us to learn from, and within that process, we have our desert periods. Faith to us Gnostics is synonymous with knowing, which is really important during the desert period. And Lord knows I understand this. When I was around 50, I went through a bad one of these. I'd been doing some reading and teaching for years, and although I enjoyed it, it was the sameness of it that was getting me down. I wanted to break out. And that's when Hay House picked up Adventures of a Psychic, a book that went on the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there for more than a year. I then got on the Montel Williams show a few years later, and I've never looked back. So many times, especially in this day and age, we look at times of inactivity as depression. Now, I'm not talking about people who need pharmaceuticals, since many of us have chemical imbalances that psychologically as well as biologically cause depression. But we often run for a fast fix instead of realizing that we charted this for ourselves. The word depressed means to press down, and many times it's nature's way of getting us to stop and take stock of our life. Even what we call accidents can be written in our charts to slow us down. I remember about 15 years ago, for example, when I was running up the steps of my front door and just nicked my right foot on one of the bricks. The next day, my foot was twice its size. I went to the doctor and found out I had blood poisoning and cellulitis, all over a little nick in my foot. I came home with pills and poultices and was relegated to soaking my foot. Thoroughly aggravated, I sat down on the couch and said, "What in the hell is this about?" The message that came in loud and clear was, "You're running too fast and you have to slow down." So when I find my clients in a desert period, I explain that to have faith, they have to be quiet and hold steady, because this truly is a time when they can learn all those miserable lessons they don't want to. The tolerance, the patience, the endurance, and the survival that they never would have learned during the frenzied times. Instead of looking at a desert period as a bad thing, I tell my clients to be still and go through it like a cleansing. This way, when their faith and knowing, like the wind, not only moves them to the joy of what they've accomplished, they'll also be moved to activation. How can this tenet help you? Whereas the previous tenets have been action-oriented, it may seem that this one suggests you stay steady or seemingly quiet but look deeper. To hold steady means to stay firm in your convictions, to be witness to your beliefs. Faith is a harsh word because you have to go on supposition. If you hold on to your beliefs in a loving God, you'll find that your faith turns into an unshakable knowing. Just to survive this hell on earth is a tremendous accomplishment for anybody. The survival period can be boring, and I know that sometimes you feel so stressed and overdone that living ceases to have any joy. That's when you've got to change, no matter how hard that is to do. However, please understand that survival can be quite different from the nothingness of the desert period. That's when you don't know what to do, and it seems that the air of life has gone out of you. But remember, this is all a charted period that you can, like any period, use for good or ill. Note that some desert periods are short while others are long, but everyone gets them. I'd advise that instead of looking at them as negative times, look at them as if you're a marathon runner. The race can be boring, but you're strengthening your soul. So use this desert period to take stock and learn and be like the wind chimes. God's wind will move you to joy at what you've learned. Tenet 7. Know that each life is a path winding towards perfection. It is a step after step that is hard, not the whole of the journey. If we look at our life in one fell swoop, it can be very daunting. Like you, in the 69 years I've lived, I feel that I've actually endured many lifetimes. Even in childhood, we take steps on many paths, depending on our themes and charts. Yet to look at our lives as a series of small steps can make things seem easier, for we can then analyze how we've gotten to where we are now. I'm going to show you what I mean by using the example of my own life. The tiny steps of our childhood can be looked at for better or worse, as the first ones on our journey of learning. Our younger years are more formative than we realize. Here we begin to forge our own self-image along with the way others make us feel. Then we get into young adulthood and hopefully finish our schooling or get a job. Every part of these phases, as you know, contains both dark and light. For instance, my college years were just golden. I had friends and parties and loved my classes. My time was filled with learning, which I dearly loved, and was studying to be a teacher. I used to throw these legendary parties every Saturday night with my father's consent, because I guess it kept me home. And it was at one of these that I met Ski. Francine had said that this would be one of my biggest steps to date. I fell madly in love with him, and I interpreted Francine's message to mean that we be married, have children, and enjoy love everlasting. However, it turns out that Ski was married, although separated, with 2 kids. He professed that it was over with his wife, but I was also Catholic and couldn't marry a divorced man. My heart was literally in shreds. For a while, the world went black and everything seemed far away. Life looked ugly and dirty for a long time. I noticed trash on the streets and flowers that were dead rather than blooming. Yet I went on having parties. Within a year, I married a policeman whom I can say I loved, but he didn't seem to love me. Looking back, as much of a rebound as this marriage seemed to be, I never would have had my sons and would never have gotten to California if it had not taken place. So as you can see, sometimes these crazy and seemingly unpredictable steps lead us on to the path we should be on. My husband Gary had lost his job over mysterious circumstances. When a friend told me of a good offer in Sunnyvale, California, we decided to move. Consequently, I had to leave my hometown, my family, and all my friends, and go to a strange place. Even though I had a job waiting for me as a teacher, I was very frightened and feeling alone. My eldest son, Paul, was my only comfort. In 1964, with $2,000 and a 1958 Chevrolet Impala convertible holding only what we could fit into it, Gary, Paul, and I moved west. I tried to tell myself that it was an adventure, but I was so very homesick. We rented a house filled with earwigs, and that first night I sat on the floor with a blanket over Paul and me as the bugs dropped around us like rain. I'll pretend I'm in a rainforest, I kept telling myself. It turns out that my husband, great opportunity, turned out to be just so much smoke. So he spent the next several months half-heartedly looking for a job. After a month arrived, my father, mother, and sister drove up and said, "Surprise! We've sold our house and have come to stay with you." For months, I was the only one working, making $275 a month. Daddy did get a job selling cars, while my mother went into substitute teaching, and Gary finally became a security guard. Although it was hell at times, being married to Gary made me grow in ways I never believed possible. One day, I told myself that I had enough, so I left Gary and filed for divorce. I had no money except a measly teacher salary, although it was now up to $500 per month. Even in the 70s, that wasn't anything to speak of. I just couldn't go to my parents, so I moved the kids and myself into the cheapest apartment I could find. Later, I started taking night school classes to get my master's, and that's when I met Bob Williams, a professor who was to become one of my dearest friends. We talked about literature a lot, but eventually I confided in him about my psychic abilities. He wanted me to use my talent, but I remained adamant about keeping it quiet. One day, Bob suddenly announced to the entire class, "Next week, Sylvia will show the class what true spiritualism is about by doing readings." As fate would have it, one of the women in the class was the head of a local women's group, and she asked if I'd come and talk. I declined. She persisted, and I finally gave in. I did a talk for that group and then another, and on it went. After I divorced Gary and remarried, my new husband, Dell, encouraged me to go public and start a foundation. I was still teaching and doing readings, and my popularity grew by word of mouth. By the end of 1972, I had begun to do readings and have small group lectures in our apartment. It got to be too much, so we moved into a townhouse. Soon after, my clientele became too disruptive for that home, so we found a tiny 2-room commercial venue in Campbell. It was in the back of a building, so we didn't even have a front entrance with a sign, but people seemed to find me. I was called by a producer from KPIX, a local CBS affiliate in San Francisco, and was asked to appear on a local television show called People Are Talking. I made so many friends from that show that they spread out and produced their own shows, and then remembered me and gave boost to my career later on. How can this tenet help you? As you can see, each step of my life may not have seemed like much at the time, but when you put the entire journey together, it's not too shabby. The same holds true for your life's path. The whole of the journey is a legacy we leave behind. Also, keep in mind that you've had many lives, and in each one you've learned a different facet of yourself. I've never talked much about my lives, but I'll cover a few here to show you how they build on each other. I had a life in Kenya, which is probably why I love that country so much. I carried water, cooked for the tribe, and died early. I had a life in Austria where I wanted children but couldn't have them, and my husband left me. I had a life as an empress in Asia, in which I lasted 27 days before I was poisoned. I had a life as a wife of a crusader. He died, and I went on to teach Gnosis. There are 54 of these lives, but what comes through many of them is a will to help. In the lives that I didn't assist others, I wasn't happy. We can take detours, but we can always live our charts and our destiny. We are what we are and what we're meant to be. We all end up taking the steps we must complete to finish our journey. It takes time, and it's quite a journey, but you're perfecting by the sheer fact that you come here to Earth in the first place. Tenet 8. Be simple. Allow no man to judge you, not even yourself, for you cannot judge God. The 8th tenet basically says that we are God because we're the genetic part of God, made by God, and we carry that spark of the divine within us. So we don't have the right to judge someone who doesn't measure up to what we think our standards are. Even our Lord said, "Judge not, lest ye be judged, and you without sin cast the first stone." It's interesting how it's taken 2,000 years for some of humankind to feel that they can judge with only half-truths. Fortunately, it's just a portion of society that acts like they have too much time on their hands. To that end, they take up causes to persecute people of different creeds, ethnic backgrounds, sexual orientation, and what have you. People are even judged by the money they make, where they live, or what their heritage is. At least now we can see people of color with a white person without fear of the lynching posse. Yet even though things are somewhat better, we're not totally there yet. Not with Latinos, Middle Easterners, Jews, and gays, among others, still being targeted for discrimination. Who do some people think they are to sit in judgment, or even propose to know the omnipotence of God, of a person's creed, sexuality, or color? You can never attain true spirituality when you have bigotry in any form in your heart. I cannot understand how, for instance, some so-called Christians can preach about Jesus and then turn around and evaluate others to the point of creating hatred and dissent among humankind. They use the parts of the Bible that are fearful in nature, which have nothing to do with Christ's teachings of love and tolerance, and call themselves Christians. They slam other religions and even churches within the same faith. They condemn homosexuality, mixed marriages, certain ethnic groups, and the list goes on and on. How on earth is this Christian? Jesus taught us to love one another, be peaceful towards others, and help one another. I don't want to pick on just the Christians, for most of them are loving and kind people, but the fanatics of any religion are becoming the scourge of humankind. Extremist viewpoints are fertile ground for dark entities to operate in, for they can then vent their hatred, bigotry, and destruction on the world under the guise of a religion or faith. Even the words extreme and fanatic suggest an unbending intolerance towards others who don't believe the way these people do. Of course, Jesus never did this. Regardless of all the negativity I've listed in this chapter, I haven't meant to elicit fear, but to just show you that all of us choose to come to this planet to learn faster than we would anywhere else. We only have one way to go about being happy, and that is to know that we're doing our part for peace, both out in the world and within ourselves. How can this tenet help you? I've found that judging yourself can often be the worst thing you can do. You learn to judge from your environment, even from your religious instruction that many times also teaches guilt. 9 times out of 10, you've been taught that you're bad or did bad things, and the conclusive result is guilt. This tenet says to lighten up on yourself. The judgment of society can be really tough. Boy, do I know. If you keep time to a different drummer, putting forth new ideas and concepts, many times society will try to put you down. Edgar Casey was tried in New York court for practicing medicine without a license. He won, but the headlines read, Seer, S-E-E-R, gets seared, S-E-A-R-E-D. What an awful humiliation for someone who is only trying to do good. And how about our Lord, who preached love and right behavior and was then crucified for it? It can seem that people who come up with goodness, love, and truth can be judged along with the criminal, sometimes even more harshly. Nevertheless, keep in mind that you're definitely a part of the divine, so don't let anyone judge you. And when you do judge evil, be careful, because you don't know the path these people have chosen. It really boils down to this: when in doubt, don't judge at all. Tenant 9. You are a light in a lonely, dark desert who enlightens many. All right, it's time to take a long, hard look at the world we live in. Most enlightened messengers have recognized that this planet we inhabit in a physical body is not just a desert, but it's also a place of illusion and many times delusion. So once we understand and embrace the world for what it is, and realize that the oasis for this desert resides on the other side, all of life becomes easier. We should also keep in mind that this world is what we make it. While we're here, why not light our lamp of enlightenment? When we do, we find that we inspire and attract others. Someone asked me just the other day, what if I love and I'm hurt? Well, loving and giving a person in light in your soul actually makes our souls deeper and fuller. Even if it doesn't work out, then we'll go on to love again and light another soul, provided that we don't become callous and close ourselves off and never feel again. If we do that, then we only end up hurting ourselves along with the countless others who would have loved us back. I'd like to remember one very important thing. Don't leave yourself in a desert or forget to light your own candle, because if you don't have a light, you can't spark anyone else's. Our Lord even makes it very clear that you should never hide your light under a bushel. In other words, bring it out into the open. Each time you love and give to others, you give water to the desert of your own soul, which may need compassion, love, advice, or sympathy just as much or more than the people you're helping. How can this tenant help you? How can you become a light? I asked myself this when I was very young and started out really wanting to save the world. Even in my writings or lectures, the amount of people I reach is small compared to the world. But I began to realize that if you can light just one candle, that candle will spark another and then another. That's where you come in. For if I can light your candle, then I know that you'll illuminate another candle and another, and then you'll become a light yourself. When I started my readings and lectures in my home, I often wondered where my light would go, but I kept telling myself to just keep going one step at a time and see what happened. I decided to hone it down to what I wanted to get across against all odds. After sifting through many things, I was led to the logical conclusion that we have an all-loving Father and Mother God, and we live many lives to perfect and follow Christ's teachings. Was it easy? Hell no. To that end, know that you're going to question yourself during this process, and even on a few dark nights, you'll wonder why you're doing what you're doing. But that's the dark side trying to attack you and make you despair. When this happens, just eject that tape and shine that light of yours that gives solace to others, a shoulder to cry on, or someone to listen or sit with in times of grief. Even helping people pass over is a blessed thing to do. We have to learn to get over ourselves and help others as Jesus taught. After all, he wouldn't have said to love your neighbor as yourself just to be saying it. All the messengers, such as Buddha, Christ, Mohammedan, taught the same thing, and all of their work will be for nothing if we all don't get it? And even more important, practice it. And when you get down to it, who I am and what I've accomplished through life after life simply comes down to loving others. This is where the light for each and every one of us comes from. We must never, ever forget this. Tenet 10. Let no one convince you that you are less than a god. Do not let fear imprison your spiritual growth. The dictionary describes fear as a feeling of agitation and anxiety caused by the presence of the imminence of danger. Sometimes this can be an imagined danger, but it doesn't matter. The adrenaline kicks in for flight or fright. Fear is a normal part of life, usually boiling down to the feeling that we're helpless and out of control. I can't tell you the times when I've told people who were afraid of flying that if you could pilot the plane themselves, they'd feel better. And 9 times out of 10, they agree. In this day and age, our entire society seems to feel out of control. And sometimes fear is so strong that it can be paralyzing. The problem with this type of negative emotion is that it stops spiritual growth. Ancient Indian beliefs state that a snake may not kill you, but the fear of a snake might. How many times do we conjure up our own worries that are unfounded, only to have them gradually take over our mind? There is an old adage that goes, fear is a great enemy of mankind. It is the enemy of his progress. It disturbs his peace and harmony. It sucks or saps his vitality and energy. It drains the nervous system of its reserve of energy, and it also produces weakness. And one of my favorite saying, a coward dies many times before his death, says a lot too. In other words, the brave know what they're afraid of, but cowards live in abject fear and imagine all the ways they can die. This is disabling and stunts spiritual growth. I'm not saying that when life gets too debilitating, we shouldn't seek counseling. In extreme cases, it's even okay to take pharmaceuticals. But it's not okay to immediately rely on them because you have an anxious moment here and there, or experiencing natural fears, or stricken by grief. When I lost 9 people who were very close to me in 3 months, for instance, the doctor said, Sylvia, you're depressed. I'm going to prescribe an antidepressant. I'm in grief, I replied, and you don't have a pill for that. Now, that doesn't mean that those who can't pull themselves out of a hole for a reasonable amount of time shouldn't seek medical help. If you become incapacitated, then realize that God made doctors too. Most of us at one time or another think that we're going crazy. So many people who saw things like I do or heard things like I do used to be dubbed crazy, while people who astrally projected were locked up. I tend to feel that crazy people don't know that they are, so they don't worry about it. They think they're normal. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be tested or see a doctor like I did, but we really must accept that there are so many things on this planet that we will never know or understand. How can this tenet help you? The East Indian belief, which is identical to our Gnostic one, is that ignorance is a cause of fear. Sometimes I despise the word ignorance because it makes us feel stupid. It actually means disregarding a truth that's available. But many times we don't even know where to go to look for the answers. So it can be like trying to find the proverbial needle in a giant haystack. Don't mistake being nervous or anxious as not being normal. Being obligated to go to court, see a doctor, attend an important meeting, or face an ex-love. These are all normal types of situation in which you might feel trepidation. It's only when it rules your life that it becomes a problem. And don't confuse foolhardiness with lack of fear. Sensible people can take chances, but when they go out of the realm of reasoning, A real bodily harm as well as mental anguish can produce a daredevil type of mentality that can be dangerous. Of course, normal fears of losing our loved ones or having our family harmed are natural and come with a human body. As your knowledge gained through reading, research, and working with people expand, fear does diminish. First of all, you become godlike and not so rooted in your own transient mortal body. To know that you're not alone in your fears is also a great cure. And as this tenet says, you are nothing less than a god. And in truly believing this, you can learn from your fears. You can also check when your fear first started and try to meditate yourself back to a life in which it could have started. What were the circumstances that led up to it? What were you doing? What was happening, or what did someone say right before the phobia or anxiety happened? Then go to the reputable therapist or certified hypnotherapist and ask God at night to take it away. It will go. Your life won't be filled with the emotion of fear, and you'll get your God center back. It's there if you find it, as I did, by reading, researching, and questioning. You are a God and carry light. Like our Lord said in Matthew 7:12, therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. And for this is the law and the prophets. I've tried to always live by this golden rule, and knowing this, and that we're human vehicles, it has alleviated fear from my life a great deal. Spirituality will pour in, and by going